Basically, what the goals of this session is that if you're taking the Cisco 600-400 exam for implementing, supporting Cisco Unified Contact Center Enterprise, it's just basically some suggestions on topic areas and documentation to review to help you prep for that exam. Some of the things we're going to cover are some of the key points that you can use when you're wanting to prepare for this exam. I'll describe some specific information as far as which CCE versions that you'll need to focus with, and then a list of documents and sources that may be useful. What will not be covered is I'm not going to basically give you specific questions out of the exam. I'm not going to violate any Cisco policy on what I can share, or at least not intentionally violate Cisco policy. And this is for the UCCEIS, the Integrating and Supporting Exam. I haven't taken a look at the deployed exam in a few years, so I can't give you a lot of suggestions in that arena. The other thing I can't do is I can't guarantee that the information I give you, Cisco might decide next week that they're going to change that exam and make everything I'm about to tell you to be obsolete. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's probably, somebody asked me yesterday, and just knowing the way Cisco works, the way they handle things, even though they've recently announced some major changes in the certification, I think it's going to take, my gut feeling is I would predict about a year from now before it would affect this exam. No guarantees on that, but that's just Mark's prediction. When preparing for the exam, one of the things that I ran across is that there's two different Cisco websites. One is, if you go to the Cisco site for moment, you go to the COM website, go through support and certification, work through a few menus, you'll eventually get to this first URL, specialist-ucceis.html, and that's going to get you to the website that describes the exam, suggestions, topics, etc. The other website is, if you go to the Cisco Learning Network website, from there, this exam is listed, but it looks a little different. The information provided there is a little different. Because of that, I thought it would make sense to go glance at it real quick. This web page, this is the one that if you go through the cisco.com, go through training and events, you'll get to this web page. It gives you some basic information, 65 to 75 questions, 75 minutes. I've taken this exam a couple times earlier this summer, like May and July timeframe. And both of those times it was 70 questions. When you look here, it mentions exam topics. I'll show you how I use this a couple different ways, but there's a PDF, and it's the same PDF regardless which website you go through. I'll show you that PDF here in a moment. But when you look at this, it gives you the main topic headers. You can click on the details and see some of the subtopics. And then they give you a percentage, a weighting percentage. What I've done is I've gone through and calculated that based upon these weightings with 70 questions, about how many questions per topic. I'll show you that in a moment. The thing that I can't tell you is that Cisco will have a tendency, so if you had, again, 70 questions, but I'm just going to make up an example. If there was 100 questions and your score was 100, it wouldn't necessarily mean 1 point per question. They might say, well, this question is more important to to someone, so we're going to give it a value of 3 points. But this other question, it doesn't matter, so it's not as important, it's not as critical for someone to know this piece of information. So we're only going to weight it maybe 0.25. So when you look at these questions, there's not a even dispersal of points. So you could miss one question and lose 10 points. You could miss a different question and lose 30 points. So I kind of take these weightings with a grain of salt, the way they list them here, because they don't publish all of the weightings that they have. Going back on this website, there's a listing for recommended training. They do suggest that it would be helpful to have the AUCCE Part 1, Part 2, and the deployment exam. The other website I think is interesting in the fact that they only list 2 of these courses. And also, having taught all 3 of these courses, I can say that there's probably about 60 to 70% of the exams are covered in these courses, but the rest of it, you might want to reference other Cisco documentation to see that information. On this website, the additional information or additional resources point you to the Cisco bookstore. The other website, the Learning Network store, or Cisco Learning Network, the link page for this exam is a little different. For example, they only show you the first 2 exams. The exam topics section is going to look fairly similar to what you saw on the other. Still trying to update. It's the problem with using a web page for a live discussion. While that's trying to refresh, I'll jump over here to this PDF. This PDF seems to be the same regardless which website you access it from. And it's similar information, it's just a different format that gives you the topics and the subtopics for each one. It's kind of interesting that it should take so long. Okay, one of the things that I was going to point out here is that I think it's under the study materials. I'm surprised it's taking so long for this to refresh. I think it's under the study materials link. They give you a page where they show the major topics, and then if you expand, it will say, for more information, go to this document. For more information, go to that document. One of the things I was a little disappointed with was that probably a third of the documents they point to are all the same document, and it's the Finesse Admin Guide, which, if that's all you relied upon, you probably would be missing some information. So what I've done is I've gone through, and on this exam topic list, what I've done is I've gone through and listed out the major topics using the percentage allocation Cisco provided us with, and then calculated, if my exam had 70 questions, how many questions would I have on each of those major topics? I always like that to kind of help me get a feel for how critical they weight a given topic area, and also how many questions I can anticipate from that topic area. The biggest one is the second topic, describe the installation process for ICM components. That's, when you see the list of documents, you would understand why that's such a high rating. The smallest amount of weighting, the topic 6, there's only 5 questions. Understanding the agent supervision issues and considerations. But you can see it's fairly evenly dispersed beyond that. For the first topic, some of the tools or some of the documents you may find useful. This first one, the Finesse Administration Guide, is one that Cisco includes on their website. there's some good information there. Some people I've talked to says, well, take the classes and read the SR&D and you'll have everything you need to know for the exams. To me, that didn't work for me for two reasons. One is I tried reading the design guide, the SR&D, and I wound up taking forever to get through it all and kept getting distracted in other areas because there's a lot of useful information and some details that I could use in there. But if you do focus, for this first topic, if you focus in that design guide for the sections titled the Unified CVP Design Considerations, the Design Considerations for High Availability, understanding the logger recovery key, traffic flow, and UDP, heartbeat, and TCP keep alive, those will be some good specific sections to look at in that document. I always mean to talk about, there's a couple things I always mean to talk about before I get to this point and forget. You'll notice that the documents I reference here are generally the UCCE release 10.0 and 10.5. I found that the exam, for the most part, if they list a version number in the question, then it's pretty much the same answer regardless which version it is. But if they're going to ask a version number, it's probably going to be in the 10.0 and 10.5 release timeframe. I think there was one or two questions that were specifically from a version 11 or 11.5 of UCCE. That's one of the reasons why I think this kind of information can be useful, because if you're in the process of trying to prepare for a version 12 deployment, that's not going to necessarily help you too terribly much with the exam, because the exam is focused on a much older release, the 10.0 and 10.5 release timeframe. One of the other things I usually try to mention is that most of the Cisco exams that you'll see, when you look at the objective list for the exams and when you look at the objective list for a course, the two objective lists are almost identical. In some cases, one comes from the other. That's why a particular course, for example, a CCNA course, is a great benefit if you're going to go take the exam. The way these exams, these UCCE exams are built, they had no correlation at all to the course development. In fact, Learning at Cisco owns most of the course development, but the ATP group that manages partner certification, they're the ones who owns these exams. And that's why there's not a very tight correlation between the exams and the courseware themselves. Just kind of going through some of the topics. For example, one of the subtopics is how you would build or explain the fault tolerance integration. And obviously, that's where you'd look at the design guide under the design considerations for CVP and the considerations for high availability. This comment about the understand the logger recovery key, there's a couple of questions you might see on the exam related to how does recovery truly work in an ICM environment, and they reference the recovery key, although the router call key and some of that information would also be useful when you're looking at the exam prep. For traffic flow, that's where they talk about the communications between various components inside of the UCCE solution. And then, of course, understanding heartbeats and keep alives. We know that within a duplex pair, router A, router B, that there are specific heartbeat intervals. I think it's once every, of course, I have to look at that to remember what it is. But the heartbeat interval is once every 100 milliseconds, and 5 missed heartbeats indicates an outage. So inside of a duplex pair, half a second. If it's between a router and a peripheral gateway, for example, then it's more like the heartbeats still in, I think it's 400 milliseconds, and then it would need 5 missed heartbeats or 2 full seconds before they mark them as down. Probably more detail than what I should have mentioned here. Just keep in mind that that's probably a good area to, if you're not comfortable with that information, you want to, because you'll see a couple of questions in there. When I was prepping for the exam, I ran across this document called Scripting and Media Routing Guide. There's actually 2 similar guides. This one, this bullet point kind of here in the middle of the screen, the Scripting and Media Routing Guide. That's one of them. This is the one that's specifically for ICM. Found a lot of good information in that document, both related to the exam as well as other areas. One of the big areas that's in this topic, topic 1, would be the section titled Call Control Variables. But then there's also a couple of sections that talk about how would you write your ICM scripts to detect system failures and how to route around them. They make reference to things like the error code or the error code variable, user.microerror_code, and how you would leverage that inside of the routing scripts. There's a few questions in there related to that topic. The Finesse Installation and Upgrade Guide. Quite a few things there. I wish I could point to 1 or 2 sections. There's a lot of different areas here in this first topic that they would talk about is covered in that document. The Serviceability Best Practices Guide. You'll see me mention that in several of these topics. It's useful for the tools, but it goes through and talks about some of the different capabilities if you're trying to do monitoring and servicing inside of a UCCE deployment. The entry for the Installation Upgrade Guide and there's a topic area called Multi-Stage Upgrades and Maintenance Windows. You might see a question along the lines of, if you were going to do 1 maintenance window or if you're going to do multiple maintenance windows, what order would you do the upgrades? In fact, I believe Sean had in an earlier session today asked a question about upgrade order. This document is a good one for that because it's questions like, would you upgrade your CUCMs first, your CVPs, and it goes through a very defined order. Which step to do that, but even things like, would you do the central controller first or would you do the PGs? And you would do the central controllers first, but it's those types of topics that's listed that you'll see related to a couple of the questions. Some of the information from AUCCE Part 2 would be in this topic, as well as the deployment class, the UCCE. The second topic, describe the installation process for the different components. If you recall from the percentage, this was the single largest percentage, which is probably why there's so many entries here. Again, there's multiple sections from the Finesse Upgrade and Installation Guide. There's information that you might find useful from the Installation and Upgrade Guide for CVP. If you're members of the next community here, there's some of our video resource library. There's the video on installing and configuring VXML. That would be useful for some of the questions you might run across. There's the outbound. There's a couple of sections that has questions on outbound, And some of them are related to things like, would you do the configurations first? Would you do the install of the components? What's a recommended order? You'll see a couple of those types of questions. There's some questions on configuring ICM for agent functionality. So we have some videos on those. Also mentioned there's the guide for outbound option for both configuration and gateways. Some of the topic areas that you might run across, and if you've done enough of this, you may recognize that when you set up the ingress-egress gateways on a Cisco iOS router, there's certain requirements. CVP needs SIP headers to be sent slightly differently than what outbound option would need. And so there are a few questions on the exam related to which configuration commands you might use for an outbound option configuration for those SIP trunks versus what you would configure for SIP trunks in your dial peers for a CVP integration. Seeing this comment about packaged, there's a section in the package design guide for version 10.5 on gateways. That could be useful to you. But the other thing is that there's also some unique values as far as scalability. When you're doing packaged in 10 versus 11 versus 12, there's some different values on how many agents would be supported. And I think in the package 10 release, it will support, I think it's, I want to say 1,000 active agents, but 2,000, and I may be getting that number mixed, but there's one number for number of agents configured. And I think that's 2,000 or 3,000 in packaged 10 and versus 1,000 concurrently logged in or active. Point is, there's been some changes in the different releases. The question you'll see on the exam is more related in the packaged 10 and 10.5 version. So you'll want to make sure you've got that number at the top of your head before you take the exam. The design guide for CVP, there's a section on ingress and VXML gateways for branch. I'll mention that a little bit later on, where there's some questions in that realm around how you would set up significant digits and how you would manage that. I'll come back to that in a few moments. There's a couple of PDFs on Cisco's website, and as well as web pages. And those describe some of the requirements on VM virtualization. There's not a lot, but there are a couple of questions that they'll ask you that's related to if you're doing a specific type of deployment on a specific tested reference configuration on a UCCEIS platform. So understanding a couple of things from the collaboration on virtual servers PDF, as well as the actual website I have listed here. Understanding a couple of those nuances would be useful on the exam. There's of course, the installation guide and the design guide. I may have mentioned the design guide a couple times here. And then the staging guide for ICM and UCCE. The staging guide is pretty good when you're getting ready to do a deployment of CCE. We talk about that quite a bit in the deploying class. There are a couple of very specific questions on the exam related to domain manager and how you would set up your Active Directory integration for ICM and domain manager. So reading that section would be useful before you take the exam. And of course, there's some administration guide information there. Just probably, administration guide would fall under the realm of one of the subtopics for this major topic is making sure that you understand how to describe routing clients and what a UCCE routing client looks like. Chances are you probably have a pretty good feel for that, but if you're unclear, the administration guide would be good for that information. Topic 3, describe the call flow scripting process. This is where we have a couple of good sections. One is, there was a document again, the scripting and media routing guide for CCE. There's a couple of sections, categorization by external data, and then the other one would be the adjust the priority of a call in queue. One of the questions, they basically show you a picture of a script in ICM script editor and basically ask you some questions about that, test to make sure you understand how queue prioritization and changing that priority in the context of a routing script affects the order of the calls processing in queue. The user guide for CVP VXML server as well as Call Studio. Again, going back to the video resource library for the AUCCE Part 1, video number 33 is discussing precision routing. There's a couple questions related to how precision routing flows, primarily with how it works inside of a routing script. There's one bullet here. I just kind of tossed that in. There's a subtopic called 3.2, describe the extended call context variables with Cisco Unified CDP. And probably the best suggestion I can give you on being prepared for those questions, just make sure you have a fair understanding of all of those user.microapp. I say fill in the blank. You might see some things on the variable from external VXML and to external VXML. You might see a question or two related to how the index of those variables work versus a scalar variable. But there's a couple that we don't talk about very heavily in class. Error code is one of them that I think will come up on the exam, which is why it's probably a good idea. In fact, in some cases, you might see questions purely on, it'll give you a list of 4 variables and ask you which one it is entered correctly. So being able to recognize the formatting for those ECC variables would be good. Mention a couple of documents that I think is actually might be good to keep in your library if you're supporting ICM. One is the scripting and media routing guide. The other one, it's, in my opinion, its companion guide, is the feature guide for writing scripts for CDP. What's nice about that guide and the document in general is that it does a pretty good detail on the use of the different micro apps. One of the areas that you might see on an exam question is there is a section in that document that discusses the use of micro apps versus a VXML server or VXML application. You might see a question or two on why you would use a micro app versus a Call Studio application or vice versa. And that's a good section that discusses that. There are a couple of other things from the deployment class that could be useful in the call flow scripting, more about how you would make the components function together. For example, the subtopic, describe configuration elements to make VXML gateway part of the deployment. That's definitely what we would talk in the deployment class, as well as the gateway configuration topic in the configuration guide. It's this one here. There's also a question or two that discusses how to configure post-call surveys in CVP. And so maybe just if you've never worked with that before you take the exam, go take a quick glance at that section. The significant digits. First time I took this exam, it actually caught me off guard because I was thinking of significant digits in the context of how many digits I would want to pass in the dial pairs. I was thinking purely in an iOS dial pair, dial plan configuration, but there's actually a feature in CVP related around the context of the site IDs, where you would build, and you do this in coordination with the locations inside of Communication Manager, CUCM, where you would define gateways would be part of a specific site ID and give that location mapping a relevance to the call and mission control configurations in Communication Manager. And whenever you do this, there's a couple of places, one of which could be inside of the service configurations for some of the parameters that you would use to pass over to the TCL and the VXML applications on the VXML gateways. And there's this document, if you look on Cisco's support site, there's a document ID 213467, which does a pretty decent job of going through and telling you why you would use it, how you would use it, and some of the different ways you would manage the configurations for that. I thought it was an interesting enough and it caught me off guard that I really picked up on that and like to make sure that you're aware of that before you go take the exam. Topic 4, not a lot of unique elements here. The topic is understanding the various tools that you'll use. And there's several documents that discuss the tools, but there was not a lot of uniqueness here that I thought worth calling out relative to some of the other topics. Probably some of the better documents here is the user guide for Finesse, as well as serviceability best practices and the configuration guide for CVP. Topic 5, similarly, this is one of those areas that you've either worked with log and trace files and understand how to access those in the UCCE context. If you haven't done that a lot, you probably want to spend a little bit of time with it. One of the things that probably is worth pointing out on the exam, there's no simulation questions. So if you're used to a CCNA or a CCNP type of exam, there's no questions where they're going to have you go in and tell you to type in this configuration command to invoke X or Y or whatever feature. But they will give you a list of commands and ask you which command has the correct syntax. Or for the log and trace information, there's a couple of questions where they'll show you output, like an EMS MON output from the JTAP gateway process, and then they'll ask you what's a likely cause of that error. So some of the specific error codes, I never could find an exact reference. I even looked at some of the CTI developer documentation for those error codes and never could find an exact reference for those. But that's how they present that, is here's some information, here's the error you might see in the JTAP gateway or the PEM process or something else, and what's a probable cause for that error code. Those are the types of things, and it's kind of hard to point out anything specific in the serviceability guide other than just how to read those log entries. For topic 6, understanding the agent supervision issues and considerations. This topic was more focused on how you do configuration for RONA, at least on the exam, I should say. And so understanding from the administration guide how to configure, so that section on redirection on no answer. And we've got a video number 34 on Rona. That might be a good one to use and look at if you're unclear on some of those configuration topics. Topic 7, understanding some call flow issues. For that one, I had to go back and actually look at the outbound option guide for UCCR 9 to find some information referencing the topic on some of the issues to avoid. Actually, that's the one that Cisco referenced on their website. I didn't go back to that one. That's the one Cisco referenced. I believe there's newer versions of that document, of the outbound option guide, that you'd probably want to reference. Again, looking at the feature guide for writing scripts for CVP, looking at that micro application use versus VXML server, the scripting and media routing guide, again, for just general call flow questions. And this next section, I really didn't come across any explicit topics, but I would say that there were a few questions that it seemed like that you could get some information or additional nuances, but I couldn't figure out exactly which topic to reference. So I would suggest you maybe take a quick look at the network design considerations for UCCE. That's going to kind of tie in pretty closely to things like the serviceability best practices on things like heartbeats and how the keep alives and all of those different settings apply. There was also a couple of questions on call admission control that I think would come across in this network design considerations. Again, can't stress enough, there are a lot of details in the SRND that would reference or be useful to you in this exam. Looking at some information about the whisper announcement, just understanding some of those capabilities. You'll see a couple of questions on that, as well as a couple of questions on the agent greeting configuration, some of that is more geared around how the micro apps are configured and some of the other things that you would need to do to set up an agent greeting. It's a lot of information and details. Any questions related on the exam or some of this information I've provided? General, what the idea here was, I guess, let me go back to that other website and see if it's responding yet. No. There we go. Part of what prompted the list that I just went through for you is that this website under the Cisco Learning Network, under study materials, I thought it was a great start how they went through and said that for these major topic areas, look at these documents. I thought it was a great start for them to provide that to us, but I thought it was also kind of weak on which topics and which documents to look at. That's why I wanted to provide this other list of documents that I've gone through and also relate them somewhat to the major topic areas. There's no questions. Hopefully I didn't bore you guys to sleep.
No, I just have a lot of things that I need to go through since you pointed out everything. So,
Yeah, I didn't want to overwhelm you, but I also wanted to say that if you're not comfortable with certain areas, here's some, rather than go doing a bunch of searching like I had to do, here's some places you can go look at.
yeah, thanks a lot because trying to get all the information off of all of the sites and then with them having all the different versions, with 7 all the way up to 12, and trying to decipher this and whatever that's needed in going through the test. Appreciate that.
You're welcome. But I'm scheduled to redo this session tomorrow at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. So if you do come up with any questions that you want to ask or anything else, feel free to join us tomorrow. If there's no other questions or anything. Oh, was there something?
Sorry, I was just wondering, is the slide deck available, or a list of the resources you're recommending available?
I know that this video will get, or one of these videos will get posted.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the deck itself, I don't know that it will be available separately, but I'll tell you what, if you go into the chat and send me your email.
Sure, I can do that. Thank you.
I'll send you a copy of the deck.
It was very informative, by the way. Sorry, I had stuck.
Good. Glad to hear that. When I first started trying to put this together, it was like, okay, how can I make this useful?
Yeah. Well, it's always fun trying to study for Cisco exams because, as you said, here's the list of resources they recommend, and then there's like 30 other ones you have to actually look at.
Yeah. Yep. I had hoped to by now have done the same type of list for the deployment exam. Every time I turn around, some other priority comes up, so I haven't gotten to that one yet.
Understandable.
Yeah, I'll probably send this email to you here and a little bit later on this afternoon.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions or requests?
Oh, no. Thank you for everything. I'm going to review all this information as much as I can tonight, and hopefully tomorrow will be more suitable for additional questions or case scenarios. So see you then.
All right. Take care.
All right.
Have a good day.
All right. You too.
You too.